Hey guys, tonight we're sneaking through flickering torchlight into the tangled, musky world of medieval intimacy. Picture it. You're in a cramped wattle and daub cottage, the hearth's coals barely warm, and the smell of boiled turnips lingering stubbornly in the air. There's no such thing as a closed door, because most homes don't even have interior rooms. You sleep shoulder to shoulder with your entire family, your livestock, and sometimes a visiting neighbor or two. Privacy? Forget it. This is a world where love letters are scratched on wooden tablets, and your alone time is measured in stolen seconds behind a haystack. And yet, in this uncomfortable little nook of time, humanity does what it always does. Flirts, gropes, giggles, dreams. You probably won't survive this one without a rash or a papal confession. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your city and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're listening under a blanket fort. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in the heart of the village, where timbered homes lean together like gossiping old ladies. Most households are 1 or 2 rooms max. If you're lucky, there's a separate space for animals. If you're not, you're falling asleep next to a pig and waking up to your uncle's snoring feet in your face. And still, somehow, people find ways to get close. Really close. The medieval bed isn't just a place for sleep or sex, it's a family hub. You share it with siblings, cousins, sometimes even traveling merchants if space is tight. Court records reveal scuffles over nighttime inappropriate touching when someone tried their luck with the wrong bunkmate. Privacy? Laughable. Yet courtship begins here. A brush of hands during bread making, whispers exchanged near the well, stolen glances while mucking the goat pen. No scented candles or lo-fi playlists, just you, sweat, and the overpowering smell of salted fish. It helps that expectations are low. You're not being judged by your cologne or dating profile. You're being judged on how many turnips you can lift, whether your bread is mold-free, and if your teeth haven't all fallen out. Tooth rot. Common. Bathing. Rare. The phrase, "love is blind," wasn't a metaphor. It was survival. Still, there's a kind of rugged charm to it all. In the absence of luxury, romance blooms in moments, lending a clean cloth for sweat, tucking in a woven blanket, plucking lice from each other's scalps. It's not sexy in the modern sense, but it's tender in a rustic, we might both have scurvy sort of way. One popular practice is bundling. In colder climates, especially among the lower classes, unmarried couples would be allowed, or even encouraged, to share a bed for warmth, but with a wooden board between them or sewn into separate sacks. No funny business, they said. Of course, accidents happened. Historians still argue whether bundling was a clever courtship custom or just a flimsy excuse for premarital canoodling. For the upper classes, things aren't much steamier, just more scripted. Courting might involve falconry outings or lute serenades, all carefully chaperoned. But eventually, everyone ends up the same way, under rough woolen sheets, hoping no one hears the creak of the floorboards. And about those sheets, let's talk texture. Linen if you're wealthy, burlap if you're not, stained with everything from candle wax to last night's stew. Comfort was not a priority. Fleas were. They nested in bedding, hair, clothing. Love bites took on a more literal meaning. People shared combs and rarely washed them. You didn't seduce with scent, you endured it. One French nobleman, famously sent his mistress a lock of hair laced with crushed cloves and rose water. Romantic? Sure. Also a desperate attempt to mask the stench of unwashed humanity. Perfumed love tokens were common among the elite, though perfumed might mean a satchel filled with lavender or deer musk. Choose your poison. Meanwhile, medieval pillows weren't always fluffy affairs. For peasants, a lump of straw wrapped in cloth had to do. Wealthier folks used bolsters, long tubes of padded linen. But even in fancy homes, head lice didn't care how many tapestries you owned. Imagine this. You finally sneak into someone's bed. The moon filters through a slit in the wall. The dog growls. Your aunt snores 2 feet away, and you're trying not to sneeze on your beloved while a spider crawls across the rafters. Mood ruined. Maybe. Or maybe not. Maybe, in that moment, you're just grateful for warmth, closeness, and a distraction from the chill of the plague-filled world outside. Humans are adaptable. Even in the least glamorous situations, we find ways to connect. A little hand-holding during Mass, a shared mug of cider, passing notes scratched into pieces of bark or wax tablets. The heart wants what it wants, and in medieval times it wanted it right there, in crowded rooms beside open fires, with a goat chewing cud 10 feet away. And believe it or not, villagers weren't all prudish about it. Seasonal festivals, like May Day, included rituals that celebrated fertility and flirtation. Couples might sneak off into the woods, claiming they were gathering flowers. Sure, January and the baby 9 months later, a gift from the fairies. So, while modern romance hinges on candlelit dinners, Spotify playlists, and endless swiping, medieval passion was more like, you smell slightly less awful than usual. Let's share this itchy blanket. And somehow, that was enough. You ease into a shadowy hallway of a stone castle now, cold, echoing, damp, and catch a flicker of candlelight slipping under a thick oak door. There's giggling, a clink of chain, and then silence. That's when you notice the odd iron contraption mounted on the wall, shaped suspiciously like medieval overkill. Could it be? A chastity belt? Well, maybe. Or maybe it's just a museum curating nonsense. The chastity belt is one of those ideas that won't die, like that one cousin who insists they were just resting their eyes during the wedding toast. You've seen it in cartoons, costume dramas, and awkward Renaissance fair skits. The classic iron knickers, padlocked and key-hoarded by some jealous nobleman before heading off to war, leaving his wife literally locked down until further notice. But here's the thing. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were real or mostly a twisted Renaissance joke passed off as fact. Most actual examples we have come from the 15th century or later, and even then, they look suspiciously ceremonial, like gag gifts for bishops with a dark sense of humor. You wouldn't exactly want to wear one around the house. They rust, they pinch, they, chafe. And let's not even talk about what happens when you sneeze. Some experts argue that if these belts were used at all, it was more for ritual or symbolic reasons than actual day-to-day wear. A kind of over-the-top, I'm so pure, not even gravity can tempt me declaration. More likely, they were displayed to shame or entertain, not secure body parts like medieval bike locks. Still, the myth persists, because it plays into our favorite medieval stereotype, that people back then were obsessed with control, especially sexual control, and in many ways they were. Just not with iron underwear. The church, ever the third wheel, had a lot to say about your bedroom habits. It wasn't just no sex outside marriage. It was when, how often, and even in which position. Spoiler, most of your favorite ones? Sinful, and anything done on feast days, holy days, or Sundays. Also sinful. Which left, what, like 2 Tuesdays in February. Now imagine trying to enforce that. Enter the confessors, the moral treatises, the ecclesiastical courts. They couldn't physically spy on you, but they didn't need to. They had guilt, peer pressure, and the very real threat of excommunication. Also, let's be honest, your neighbor probably snitched. But despite all this hand-wringing, medieval people weren't living in celibate gloom. In fact, they got creative. Secret staircases, false walls, the old "I was just here to borrow flour" excuse. Lust, after all, didn't care if your soul was in peril. It just wanted 15 minutes alone and a hayloft that didn't squeak too loud. In royal courts, where marriages were forged for land and alliances, actual romantic attraction was rare. Noble women were often married off as teens to older men with questionable breath and political ambitions. But behind the curtain, there were poems, flirtations, and the occasional knight who lingered too long during a falconry lesson. Love affairs could be passionate, even tender, though dangerous. Adultery wasn't just a scandal. It could cost you your land, your title, or your life. For lower-class folks, things were looser in some ways and stricter in others. You might fall for a miller's daughter and promise marriage by the next harvest. But if someone caught you two rolling in the hay before the vows, that could land you in the manorial court, fined and shamed, or forced into a shotgun wedding before you could say, "Oops." One weird historical tidbit? In parts of Europe, couples caught being intimate without commitment might be paraded around the village on donkeys, backwards of course, with jingling bells and rude songs for the entire community to enjoy. Nothing says walk of shame quite like being compared to livestock. Back in noble circles, controlling women's sexuality wasn't just about virtue, it was about lineage. If your wife had a child, you needed to be absolutely sure it was yours, because land and titles were passed through bloodlines. So keeping noble women pure wasn't about love. It was about property rights with better handwriting. That's partly why the chastity belt myth endures. It symbolizes this desperate, almost comical attempt to lock down desire in a world where desire kept leaking through the cracks, like wine through a badly sealed barrel. And, speaking of symbols, many actual belts found in museums today were likely created centuries after the Middle Ages, probably during the Victorian era, when people had feelings about sex but couldn't talk about them without fainting. They were obsessed with the naughty past. Nothing titillates quite like pretending your ancestors were horny and helpless. Some artists and writers of the time even fabricated chastity belts for exhibitions, placing them behind glass like relics of medieval kink. But that's the thing about history. It gets tangled up with fantasy, especially when sex is involved. Still, the fear of uncontrolled female sexuality was very real in medieval society. That's why you find so many laws, sermons, and grim little warnings carved into door frames and confessionals. Women were expected to be gatekeepers of virtue. Men, meanwhile, were expected to try their luck and then apologize during Lent. Yet somehow people managed. They flirted, wrote poems, snuck kisses during harvest dances, and found a way through all the restrictions. The iron belt may be a myth, but the human desire it supposedly guarded? Very, very real. And that desire kept clashing with rules, expectations, and sometimes even armor. But more on that later. You wipe the fog off a glass window. a rare luxury, by the way, and peer into a flickering room where bare shoulders glisten beside candlelit tubs. Welcome to the medieval bathhouse. It smells like herbs, sweat, soap made from ashes, and maybe just a little sin. You weren't expecting this much nudity this early in the evening, but here we are. In the Middle Ages, bathhouses weren't just places to wash up. They were the social clubs of the era, a bubbly cross between a sauna, a tavern, and a very flirtatious dinner party. Men and women often bathed together. Yes, together. Don't let all that doom and gloom Dark Ages branding fool you. People in the medieval period actually bathed more than some of their Renaissance descendants. You ease down onto a wooden bench and watch a couple giggle as they pour scented water over each other's backs. It's intimate, yes, but also surprisingly public. Other people chat, sing, and flirt nearby. Attendants bustle around with towels. Someone's nibbling a pastry. There's even mulled wine. You're not sure if this is self-care or foreplay. The bathhouses, especially in cities like Paris, Cologne, and London, were everywhere, often just a short stroll from the marketplace. And, despite the church's frequent pearl-clutching, they remained wildly popular until about the 16th century, when syphilis and the Protestant Reformation teamed up to ruin everything fun. In some cases, bathhouses were officially regulated, licensed, and taxed. They had names like the Angel, the Red Rose, or, more mysteriously, the Steamy Window. Coincidence? Probably not. While many bathhouses were innocent, family-friendly affairs, others definitely doubled as brothels, sometimes even with the full knowledge of the town council. You know, just to keep things organized. Historians still argue whether most bathhouses were genuinely salacious or just occasionally misused by locals looking for a steamy shortcut to divine damnation. It depends on the region, the year, and the rules. In some places, mixed bathing was strictly forbidden. In others, it was just considered polite to keep eye contact above the waterline. The word stew was even used as slang for bathhouses, and, by extension, brothels. That's right. Next time you hear stew in a medieval context, it might not involve carrots. But let's rewind for a second. Why were bathhouses so big in the first place? Because hygiene wasn't always medieval society's Achilles heel. Soap existed. People liked to feel clean. Bathing was linked to health, not just vanity. Physicians recommended warm baths to soothe imbalanced humors, relax the womb, or even stir up fertility. Some guides suggested different herbs based on your ailments. Rosemary for muscle pain, chamomile for nerves, lavender for, well, everything. And then there's the ritual of it all. Couples might use the bathhouse as part of wedding preparations. It was a way to cleanse the body and maybe test drive some chemistry before the big night. Nobles sometimes ordered large wooden tubs filled in their own chambers, surrounded by screens, furs, and enough rose petals to drown a small dog. But it wasn't just about couples. Friends bathed together. Entire families. Colleagues. Business negotiations even happened mid-soak. And if you were rich, you could hire a private attendant to scrub your back while you dictated letters. Of course, with great steam comes great temptation. That's where the bans started rolling in. City councils passed ordinances. No immoral behavior in bathhouses, they warned. No night visits. No mixed nudity after sundown. Naturally, these rules were often ignored. As long as the bathhouses kept their taxes paid and outbreaks of plague were avoided, most towns looked the other way. But the church? Oh, it noticed. especially when priests themselves were caught sneaking in through the back door in borrowed cloaks. Church authorities preached that bathhouses encouraged lust. They blurred the sacred line between cleanliness and carnality. Some theologians went so far as to say that nudity, even unintentional, was an invitation for the devil to join the party. Cue the sermons, the scandals, the sinners weeping in confessional booths after accidentally lingering too long in the warm pool of temptation. You can almost hear the monks sighing behind the screen. Again? Still, people kept coming, because after a long day of butchering pigs, hauling sacks of grain, or pretending to be interested in court poetry, a hot soak sounded better than penance. And if someone nice happened to wash your hair during it, even better. Let's not forget the role of professional bathers. Yes, that was a job. Often, young women, they'd help you undress, scrub your limbs, even sing softly while rinsing you down. Some were hired purely for practical reasons. Others became, let's say, repeat requests. This is where bathhouse culture blurred into sex work. And medieval sex work, far from being universally shunned, was in many cases tolerated, taxed, and even regulated. In cities like Florence, Nuremberg, or Avignon, brothels were part of the civic landscape. Some had operating hours, dress codes, even menus. You could choose based on profession, price, or specialty. Local authorities believed that by organizing sin they could contain it, an approach historians still debate to this day. One fringe tidbit. In some bathhouses, private rooms were disguised behind wall tapestries. The staff might serve you wine and dates, then quietly offer the option of a relaxing massage with your soak. No one wrote this down, of course, but the sudden surge of backdoor entries on property ledgers is telling. But then came the 16th century. The Protestant Reformation swept through like a very dry sponge. Public bathing fell out of favor, seen as indulgent, impure, and spiritually risky. The spread of venereal disease also turned public tubs into suspected cauldrons of contagion. The very idea of mixed-gender naked time began to feel dangerous, sinful, medieval in the worst way. By the 17th century, most public bathhouses in Western Europe had closed or transformed into something tamer. Apothecaries, tea houses, or sterile urban spas with no rose petals in sight. Still, for a few hundred years, the medieval bathhouse was one of the most unexpected places where sensuality, hygiene, and social life all tangled together. Naked, giggling, and slightly tipsy. And as you leave the steamy warmth behind, towel slung over your shoulder, you realize people back then weren't that different. Just wetter. Now you're sitting uncomfortably still on a creaky wooden bench in a candlelit hall, somewhere between your 6th goblet of weak ale and your 3rd plate of roast pheasant. Lutes are playing, someone's shouting about dowries, and a grandmother is weeping. Not from joy, but from stress. Welcome to the medieval wedding feast, where love and law tangle tighter than corset strings. Across the room, the couple of the hour sit wide-eyed beneath a canopy, hands clasped, pretending this isn't the most awkward moment of their short lives. They've just pledged vows, traded rings, if they're fancy enough, and now they wait. For the food, for the stairs, for the bedroom door to creak open after dessert. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't about romance. It was a legal contract, a fusion of property, family honor, and dynastic politics, sealed not just by parchment, but by the act of consummation. Yes, that part mattered. A lot. so much so that witnesses were sometimes required to confirm it happened. Not in the room itself, though there were truly unfortunate exceptions, but listening just outside the door, waiting for signs, a squeaky bedpost, a satisfied sigh, or a loudly declared, "Praise be, it is done." Medieval pillow talk needed work. In some noble households, the couple was escorted to bed after the feast by a crowd of family members holding torches, offering helpful advice and far too much eye contact. Then the bed curtains were drawn, the door shut, and the long, expectant silence began. Because a marriage without consummation, that could be annulled. Land deals could collapse. Alliances could crumble. So, yes, your wedding night was part of the legal system, and there was paperwork, lots of it. Now, before you panic, not every couple faced that level of scrutiny. Among peasants and townsfolk, marriage could be much simpler. In some areas, simply declaring your union in front of witnesses, with the intent to be married, was enough to make it legally binding. No priest required, no church bells, just a, "Hey, this is my person now," followed by some mutual agreement on goats and shared chores. Still, even in the countryside, consummation was what sealed the deal. You might exchange tokens, rings, belts, garlands, but nothing spoke quite as loudly as spending a night together and waking up still legally entangled, which is why, in some parts of Europe, a curious ritual called bedding the bride took place. After the feast, the newlyweds were led to bed by friends and family. Yes, again, with the community sometimes singing bawdy songs or throwing nuts. The couple might be tucked in, offered warm milk or honeyed wine, and told to get on with it, while the door shut and everyone went back to dancing. In certain courts, especially among royals, the next morning included a sheet inspection. A bloodstain was seen as proof of virginity, though anyone who's read more than one book knows this is biologically unreliable at best and, frankly, terrifying at worst. Some brides, terrified of what was expected, resorted to desperate measures. Chicken blood, pricked fingers, bits of red-dyed cloth. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or folklore exaggeration. But there's enough anecdotal evidence to suggest a fair number of brides came prepared for dramatic theatrics. The groom wasn't off the hook either. He was expected to perform, and perform well. A failure to consummate the marriage, especially among the elite, could lead to annulments, public embarrassment, or worse. One French nobleman famously had to undergo a court-supervised examination of his genitals to prove he was capable. Talk about a hard day at the office. And of course, not all wedding nights were sweet and consensual. Marriage, even legal and celebrated, did not guarantee comfort or safety. Women were often married young, 14, sometimes younger, especially among nobles where childbearing was part of the dynastic pressure. The expectations placed on them were immense, and their agency was often minimal. Yet, even within these rigid structures, intimacy sometimes blossomed. Diaries and letters revealed tenderness. Couples grew fond, playful. There were inside jokes, shared routines, love stories that started awkwardly and ended in devotion. One curious fringe practice? In some regions, a priest might bless the marriage bed itself, sprinkled with holy water, marked with crosses, and prayed over like a battlefield tent. Because in many ways, it was a spiritual, social, and reproductive battleground, all in one itchy, creaky, bug-infested mattress. And yes, let's talk beds. They were high, often requiring a step stool, and layered with straw, wool, or down, depending on your income. Rich folks had hangings and tapestries for warmth and privacy. Poor folks, they had blankets shared with siblings and the occasional passing cat. Which brings us to the concept of marriage debt. That's not a financial term, it's intimate. Medieval canon law held that spouses owed each other conjugal relations. A wife couldn't refuse her husband without reason, and vice versa. The body, once married, was no longer yours alone. It was shared property. Cozy, right? But there were limits. Too much sex, that could be sinful. Certain positions, definitely sinful. Doing it during Lent, Advent, or on saint days. Don't even think about it. Historians have counted over 100 days a year when relations were forbidden by the Church. Factor in illness, pregnancy, or travel, and you begin to wonder how anyone had children at all. And yet, they did. Many. Medieval families were often large, though not always by choice. Contraception was rudimentary, we'll get to that soon, and child mortality was high. Marriages, particularly among the upper class, were often as much about producing heirs as they were about companionship. Still, in the quiet moments, after the crowds dispersed, the sheets were rumpled, and the cold air crept in, some couples found something more. A laugh, a shared joke about the priest's long sermon, the comfort of someone else's breathing beside you in the dark. Because even with all the rituals, legalities, and pressure, the medieval wedding night wasn't just about politics. It was also the beginning of a shared life, however complicated, unequal, or flawed. And sometimes, despite it all, it worked. You tiptoe now through a cloister garden, damp stone underfoot, evening light slanting across rose bushes lovingly trimmed by celibate hands. The air is hushed, but charged, like the world is holding its breath. A monk chants softly in the distance. A nun kneels in prayer, face serene. But what's that tucked under the bench? A folded piece of parchment, sealed with wax and perfumed with crushed violets. Congratulations. You have just stumbled upon one of the most tightly guarded secrets of the Middle Ages. Desire behind monastery walls. The ideal was clear. Monks and nuns were to renounce the world, along with wine, riches, and the messy entanglements of flesh. Their lives were supposed to revolve around God, not each other. They wore simple habits, took vows of chastity, and filled their days with prayer, manual labor, and quiet reflection. But human nature doesn't always read the rule book. Beneath the surface of these holy orders simmered temptations, longings, and, yes, love letters. Illicit ones, hidden between pages of psalters, scratched into the margins of sacred texts, or whispered during moments of shared silence in the garden, while the bees hummed and no one was watching. You think you're imagining things, until you realize medieval record keepers were nothing if not thorough. There are court records, confessional accounts, and even bawdy tales passed between pilgrims that point to a very real phenomenon: cloistered love affairs. Historians still argue whether these were frequent, rare, or somewhere in between. But enough survive to suggest that monastic life wasn't always the dry, ascetic existence we assume. Take Brother Richard of Saint Benoit. His name appears in a 14th century document alongside accusations of frequent visitation to the nuns across the river. Apparently, he went there for confession, every week, at sunset, for 3 years. A very, very sinful commute. Or Sister Agnes, who was found to be in possession of a mirror, a love token, and an embroidered handkerchief bearing a knight's initials. She claimed the items were for spiritual reflection. The abbot was not convinced. Then there's the poetry. Oh, the poetry. Many monks were literate, educated, and prone to long bouts of melancholic rumination, which makes for excellent romantic verses. Some love poems survive that were clearly written by or addressed to monastics. Lines about aching hearts, forbidden touch, and the agony of desire unfulfilled. Some are so tender, so clearly personal, it's hard not to imagine the trembling hands that penned them by candlelight. And don't get us started on the marginalia. You know those doodles in the edges of illuminated manuscripts? Among the angels and saints, you'll sometimes find surprises. Nuns pulling up their skirts, monks caught mid-embrace, rabbits behaving very badly. Were these the work of bored scribes with wicked imaginations? Maybe, but they're awfully specific. Church authorities knew temptation lurked in the cloister. That's why monasteries and convents were often physically separated, sometimes by leagues. But in places where they sat near each other, tunnels were dug, messages were passed. Glances were exchanged over shared wells, and on festival days when monks and nuns, gasp, actually mingled. Let's not forget the traveling confessors and visiting clergy. These men often entered nunneries to hear confessions, offer Mass, or check on the sister's spiritual progress. Some left with a lot more than prayers. In one documented case, a nun in 13th century England gave birth and tried to bury the evidence, literally. She was caught, excommunicated, and her lover, a priest, vanished overnight. It's tragic, yes, but also telling. Because where there's isolation, restriction, and denial, there's usually rebellion. Now, to be fair, many monks and nuns truly did live chaste, devoted lives. The monastery offered peace, education, and a structured routine that some found fulfilling. Not everyone was sneaking off for a moonlit rendezvous behind the herb garden. Still, the rules were strict for a reason. One broken vow could unravel the sanctity of an entire order. And when scandal did erupt, it shook communities to the core. Curiously, medieval medical texts sometimes blamed these temptations not on lack of willpower, but on imbalanced humors, especially among nuns. It was believed that celibate women could suffer from a condition called suffocation of the womb if their desires weren't, properly managed. Treatments included herbal baths, vigorous exercise, or, in some dubious cases, surgical intervention. Because nothing says holy healing like a leech bath and a side of judgment. And here's the fringe tidbit of the night. Some convents actually became centers of culture, music, and even subversive literature. Noble women with sharp intellects and no desire for arranged marriage would sometimes choose the cloister as a haven. Inside, they wrote, painted, composed hymns, and yes, occasionally poured their hearts into secretly circulated love poetry. One letter survives from a nun to her presumed lover, written in Latin, in which she refers to herself as his little dove, and begs for news of his health, his safety, and his touch. You can almost feel the ink drying beneath her breath. Of course, not all monastic relationships were romantic. Some were coercive, exploitative, or born from loneliness and desperation. The walls of the monastery didn't always protect. Sometimes they trapped. And the church's official stance, zero tolerance, often made it harder for victims to come forward or be believed. So here you are, in this stone-walled garden, holding a letter that was never supposed to survive. It smells faintly of old wax and pressed lavender. The writing is careful, the phrasing modest, but the emotion beneath it, raw, real, undeniable. Behind all the chants, the incense, the vows, and the rituals, there were always two beating hearts, separated by robes, vows, and expectations, but reaching anyway. Because even in the most sacred places, love found cracks. It slipped between the stones, curled into the corners of cloisters, and bloomed in the silence. The fields stretch out golden in the late afternoon sun. Wheat brushing your fingertips as you walk past low stone walls and the occasional yawning cow. You hear laughter ahead, muffled, familiar, and distinctly human. You pause near a hayrick and peek around its scratchy edge. Two young peasants, dirt under their nails, joy in their eyes, exchange a kiss so soft and private. It's as if time itself takes a breath and lets them be. Welcome to the quieter side of medieval romance, where lords and priests might run the show on paper, but love and lust still bloom in the margins, in meadows, barns, and behind the hedgerows. You're not in a castle anymore. No stewards, no banners, no chaperones. Just open fields, honest sweat, and the sharp tang of cider on the breeze. And here, under this wide sky, courtship plays by a different set of rules. For the average medieval peasant, love wasn't scribbled in poetry. It was whispered between chores, between sowing seeds and scrubbing floors, between chasing geese and haggling at the market. It was practical, earthy, and as grounded as the soil they worked. Still, even with calloused hands and sunburnt faces, people flirted. They joked. They danced. And sometimes they snuck off into the tall grass. One of the most common places to find a new crush? Seasonal festivals. May Day was especially famous, and not just for its flower crowns. Young men and women would gather in forests and meadows to celebrate fertility, the changing of the season, and, let's be honest, each other. Songs were sung, garlands exchanged, and the phrase going a-maying often meant more than just picking wildflowers. You weren't just gathering daisies. You were gathering experience. Villages often looked the other way. Babies born 9 months later were sometimes dubbed May children, and everyone pretended they were miracles. Historians still argue whether these rituals were ancient fertility rites or just convenient excuses for seasonal mischief. Still, rural romance was rarely reckless. Most peasants knew that love came with consequences, namely, children. And children needed food, shelter, and someone to chase after them when they ran face first into a goose. So, even if you shared a tumble behind the granary, chances were marriage would follow, or at least a very serious conversation with your father. But don't mistake peasant love for grim obligation. There's a tenderness in the records that's often overlooked. A note passed in church. A carved heart on a wooden spoon. A young man walking 2 miles out of his way just to accidentally pass by the spinning house and say hello. In many cases, peasant couples had more freedom to marry for affection than their noble counterparts. While lords and ladies were bartered like chess pieces, a blacksmith could choose the baker's daughter for her laugh, not her land. A shepherd might fall for a milkmaid based on shared jokes and shared chores. It's not to say families didn't meddle, they did. Parents often arranged matches, especially if land or tools were involved. But the emotional stakes were real. Couples sometimes resisted arranged marriages and fought, sometimes literally, to be with the one they wanted. A court case from 1372 documents a girl who ran away with a man after her father refused to let them wed. The village priest married them in secret. The fallout was dramatic, but ultimately love won. One lesser-known tradition: hand fasting. In some areas, couples pledged themselves to each other in front of witnesses without a priest. This informal union, sometimes a trial marriage, sometimes a permanent one, was considered binding by many communities. And yes, it usually included spending the night together. No blood-stained sheets required. These unions were flexible, especially in remote villages where church officials weren't always watching. They allowed people to test the waters before fully committing. In modern terms, kind of like moving in together, but with more sheep and fewer throw pillows. Of course, not all peasant encounters were gentle or mutual. Power imbalances still existed. A lord might take liberties with a servant. A brewer's apprentice might be pressured into silence. The village wasn't a utopia. It had predators, secrets, and shame. And justice, when sought, was inconsistent at best. But in the middle of all that, real connection, a dance around the bonfire, a kiss shared beside a rain barrel. Laughter echoes through the hills during harvest. The kinds of moments that didn't make it into the church records, but lived on in lullabies and cider-fueled memories. Even sex had a rhythm here. Not the lurid secrecy of court, but a part of life, like gathering firewood or shooing chickens from the path. Couples learned from older siblings, from overheard stories, from what their bodies already seemed to know. Privacy was rare, but understanding wasn't. A fringe detail? Some villages had designated bundling nights, especially in the cold months, where unmarried men and women were allowed to sleep beside each other, fully clothed, separated by a wooden plank or a heavy board, ostensibly for warmth. Practically speaking, let's just say boards can be climbed. And speaking of creative boundaries, one recorded English practice had parents stitching their daughters into bundling sacks before allowing a suitor to sleep beside them. A literal zipped-up sleeping bag made of linen and worry. Whether it worked depended less on thread strength and more on determination. Despite all the mud, sweat, and church bells, there was a sweetness here, a resilience. You can almost hear it now. The low strum of a fiddle, the clatter of mugs, the rustle of skirts through barley. Somewhere nearby, a pair of hands find each other in the dark. Calloused fingers brushing calloused fingers. Because love, like weeds, grows in the cracks. And even in a world of toil and taxes, people still found time for each other. Behind hayricks, beyond curfews, and beneath the stars, you find yourself now at the edge of a city market, where the smells of boiled onions, smoke, and sweat mingle with the shrieks of hawkers selling everything from pewter spoons to love potions. Just behind the fishmonger's stall, nestled in a shadowy alley draped with drying laundry, is a small faded sign in Latin. You squint. It reads, loosely, House of Comfort. Ah, yes, you've found the local brothel. In medieval cities, these establishments weren't always seedy dens of secrecy. In fact, in many regions, they were fully legal and municipally regulated. You could almost call them civic infrastructure, like a toll bridge, but with more perfume and fewer horses. Take 14th century London, for example. The entire Southwark district across the Thames was essentially designated for vice: gambling, alehouses, and brothels. These brothels were taxed, monitored, and managed under the somewhat absurd assumption that if authorities controlled immorality, they could prevent chaos. Spoiler, they mostly just renamed the chaos and charged admission. And so, sex work operated in broad daylight. Stews, as they were commonly called, had signs, staff, and sometimes even uniforms. A woman might wear a colored ribbon or a specific gown to signify her trade. Clients ranged from knights to butchers, clergy to scribes. Some came for comfort. Others came for, well, comfort plus storytelling. Inside, the rooms were basic. Brush-covered floors, thin bedding, maybe a painted wall or two if you were in a nicer place. There were rules, too, believe it or not. No visiting on holy days. No violence. No underage girls. No sleepovers. And definitely no kissing on the mouth in some regions. That, apparently, was too intimate for a transactional relationship. The brothel madams, or bawds as they were called, often had considerable power. Some were former workers themselves, others widows or savvy entrepreneurs who understood how to keep clients happy and guards paid. Many madams paid high taxes, bribed officials, and kept ledgers as detailed as any merchant guild. You might be wondering, how did the church feel about this? Badly, very badly, and yet also pragmatically. In many places, church leaders tolerated brothels as a necessary lesser evil, a pressure valve to prevent greater sin. Think of it as medieval moral damage control. Better, they argued, that men visit professional women than seduce innocent ones and throw the social order into disarray. Of course, this logic is laughable today, but at the time, it created an uneasy truce between sin and structure. Even Street Thomas Aquinas wrote about it with the weary tone of a man who knows he can't win. "Remove prostitutes from society," he wrote, "and you will unsettle everything with lust." Yet, beneath the surface of this civic moral compromise were real women, working class, often poor, sometimes trafficked or orphaned, trying to survive in a system stacked against them. Some entered sex work by choice, others by force or desperation, and their lives were rarely romantic or safe. While a few madams rose to influence, most sex workers faced precarious health, social stigma, and little protection. Diseases ran rampant, though they wouldn't be called venereal until later centuries. Early forms of syphilis and gonorrhea were misdiagnosed as hot blood or leaky humors, and treatment often involved herbs, wine baths, or mercury, which, fun fact, just made everything worse. Despite this, brothels were often centers of community knowledge. Women there knew more about anatomy, contraception, and pleasure than most doctors, and shared that knowledge with each other. They used sponges soaked in vinegar, pessaries made of herbs and wool, and, in a pinch, globs of tree resin as primitive contraceptives. Not recommended, by the way, just noted. One fringe fact: in some cities, prostitutes were legally forbidden from wearing belts, as they symbolized chastity, and instead required to wear striped hoods or open sleeves to identify them. The idea was transparency. That way, respectable women wouldn't be confused with workers. Because, the real crime wasn't the transaction. It was dressing like someone your aunt would invite to dinner. Yet, despite all this visibility, there was still shame. Many women in the trade tried to hide their identities or left the city altogether after a few years to marry or join a convent. Yes, that happened. Some nuns were former sex workers, reformed and tucked behind cloistered walls, writing prayers to forget their past. Others brought with them deep empathy, and maybe a side of smirking honesty. There were moments of solidarity, too. In some towns, prostitutes had their own patron saints, held feast days, and even left money in wills to help younger women get out of the trade. Some brothels acted like sororities, fierce loyalty, strict house rules, and at least one person who'd always tell you if your shift was crooked. And, for the record, not all encounters in brothels were cold or transactional. Some clients formed real attachments. A few even married the women they met there. Scandalous, sure, but not unheard of. There are poems, letters, and even court cases where love spilled out of the walls of the stew and into the real world. Historians still debate whether legalizing brothels helped or harmed women in the long run. Some argue it offered a measure of protection. Others insist it cemented their second-class status. Like everything medieval, the truth is likely both. But in the soft lamplight of this imaginary alley, you can hear the quiet murmur of an exhausted worker leaning out a shutter, watching stars rise above the chimney smoke. Somewhere down the lane, another pours a jug of ale, wipes her hands on her apron, and waits for the next knock. Not all work is noble, but not all workers are lost. The flicker of candlelight plays across a wooden table as you duck into a small apothecary tucked behind the cathedral square. Shelves creak under the weight of jars filled with dried herbs, animal bones, and substances you're pretty sure are illegal now. A woman in a stained apron eyes you from behind the counter, mortar and pestle in hand, grinding something that smells faintly of rosemary and smoke. Welcome to the under-the-table world of medieval birth control. A cocktail of folk remedies, whispered secrets, and a lot of hope. Let's get one thing straight. The Church made its stance on contraception perfectly clear. Don't. Ever. Not in a barn, not in a castle. Not even if you've already had 10 children and the roof leaks when it rains. According to official doctrine, every act of sex had to be open to life, or at least the theoretical possibility of divine intervention. But humans, being humans, often had other ideas. So what did people do? They improvised. Sometimes with cleverness, sometimes with desperation, sometimes with horrifying creativity. Let's start with the herbs. Across medieval Europe, women passed down plant-based contraceptive knowledge through word of mouth. Certain herbs were believed to prevent pregnancy if taken before or after sex. Others were used to terminate it, though at serious risk. One of the most famous was silphium, used extensively in the Roman world. By the Middle Ages, it was extinct, possibly because it worked too well. Its successor was pennyroyal, a bitter minty herb that in high doses could cause uterine contractions. Women steeped it in tea, chewed it raw, or blended it with wine. Helpful? Maybe. Dangerous? Definitely. Another remedy? Rue, which doubled as a cooking ingredient and a medicinal abortifacient. There were also potions involving fennel, juniper berries, and wild carrot seed, also known as Queen Anne's lace. Women might keep these on hand not just for seasoning, but for timing. Because yes, timing mattered. Medieval women tracked their cycles by moon phases, physical signs, or the classic counting on your fingers and praying method. Some believed in post-coital techniques, jumping up and down, sneezing, really, or squatting over steaming herbs. Others swore by magical amulets, like wearing a weasel's testicle around the neck, because nothing says protection like dangling wildlife. Now, whether these methods were effective is debatable. Historians still argue over how much was placebo, how much was real, and how much was wishful thinking. But the persistence of these recipes suggests they must have worked occasionally, or at least offered hope. What about the men? Well, male contraception didn't get the same airtime, but there were crude condoms made from linen soaked in chemicals or animal intestine. They weren't common, but they existed, especially among soldiers or frequenters of brothels trying to avoid disease. Sometimes people even used oiled parchment as a barrier. Romantic? Not exactly, but functional enough to be recorded. Let's not forget the withdrawal method, which, despite sounding modern, was well known. Church authorities condemned it as both unnatural and suspiciously selfish. But medieval texts prove it was practiced and, in some circles, even advised by midwives or herbalists as a safer sin. Speaking of sin, here's where things get murky. While the Church condemned contraception, enforcement was inconsistent. In some places, women were prosecuted for herbal use. In others, midwives quietly carried pouches of moon tea without consequence. Often, it came down to class. A noblewoman might face a scandal. A peasant woman? Probably just another quiet funeral for a lost batch of herbs. Fringe tidbit of the night. Some texts advised tying a live frog to your inner thigh for a full moon cycle to prevent conception. Who discovered this? Who agreed to it? Who removed the frog afterward? All unknown. Still, among the better-off classes, abstinence was the only officially acceptable method of birth control. And not just during Lent or Advent. Some married couples practiced periodic abstinence with clerical approval. Letters between confessors and lay people show a surprising amount of detail. Can I avoid sex if we are already burdened with children? Is it sinful if I don't feel desire? Can I pretend to be asleep? And yet, even devout believers bent the rules. Behind closed doors, they sought advice from local healers. In Florence, records show noblewomen sending servants to distant villages to retrieve specific tinctures, often hidden among soap or fabric. In England, one abbey report scolds a nun who had been caught growing suspicious herbs in the cloister garden. Some of these potions may have caused more harm than good. Mercury, for example, was sometimes used to cleanse the womb, despite being wildly toxic. Lead, another common ingredient, caused miscarriages and irreversible damage. Women knew the risks but chose them anyway, often because they saw no alternative. For many, it wasn't about defiance. It was survival. A peasant woman with 6 mouths to feed couldn't afford a 7th. A prostitute in a stew house couldn't risk pregnancy ruining her means of income. A married couple struggling to survive a winter with no grain might see abstinence not as virtue, but as necessity. So, despite the sermons, the fear, and the legal risks, the knowledge endured. Whispered between sisters, hidden in marginalia, passed down not in grand tomes but in crooked handwriting on the back of a recipe scroll. Boil for 7 minutes. Drink before sundown. Do not tell father. Even some physicians were in on it. Discreet notes appear in medical texts. Recipes labeled to encourage menses were often coded instructions for terminating pregnancies. You had to know what to look for, of course, but many women did. It's easy to romanticize the past or vilify it outright. But here, in this dusty shop, surrounded by jars of dried hope and anxiety, you realize that medieval people weren't so different. They wanted love. They wanted pleasure. And sometimes they just wanted a break. And even when the world told them no, they found a way to whisper yes. Into the soil, into the teacup, into the night. The cathedral bells toll dusk as you pass through an open city gate, dodging a donkey cart and slipping into a quieter lane where ivy climbs the walls and candles flicker in high windows. Tonight feels secretive, private. And that's fitting, because what you're about to witness is something few ever spoke of directly, but many in medieval Europe experienced: same-sex love. It's easy to assume that medieval attitudes toward homosexuality were uniformly harsh. And yes, the Church officially condemned it as a grave sin. Sodomy, an umbrella term that conveniently included anything not heterosexual, marital, and procreative, was criminalized in many regions. Punishments varied from fines and penance to exile or, in extreme cases, execution. The rhetoric was fierce, the sermons fiery. But the reality? Far murkier, much more human. Because same-sex attraction didn't vanish under threat of punishment. It simply went underground, or, more intriguingly, sometimes stayed in plain sight, disguised as friendship. Let's start with monasteries and convents, those places you might remember from the cloister gardens and hidden letters. They were single-gender environments where people lived, worked, and prayed together, often for decades. Strong emotional bonds were not just common, they were expected. Monastic writings frequently describe deep, affectionate love between brothers and sisters in Christ. But sometimes it went further. Letters survive between monks and nuns that use language so tender, so longing, they read like romance. Phrases like, "my beloved in soul and flesh," or "I ache for your touch," weren't exactly subtle. Of course, some scholars argue these were spiritual metaphors. Others aren't so sure. Historians still debate whether these expressions were platonic or coded declarations of love, and maybe more. Outside the cloister, male friendships among the nobility could be intense. In medieval France and England, it wasn't unusual for knights to swear loyalty not just to their lord, but to each other, complete with vows, exchanged tokens, and even shared beds. These arrangements, sometimes called brotherhood in arms, were publicly celebrated. And, though officially chaste, they sometimes blurred into emotional or physical intimacy, one of the most debated cases. King Edward II of England and his close companion Piers Gaveston. Their relationship scandalized the court. Gaveston was showered with gifts, titles, and affection beyond all reasonable explanation. Chroniclers of the time muttered about undue familiarity and unseemly indulgence. When Gaveston was murdered by nobles, Edward reportedly grieved with such ferocity that some interpreted it as the heartbreak of a lover. Was it romantic? Was it political? Historians still argue. Among women, the lines were even blurrier. Close emotional and physical intimacy between women was often considered normal, even healthy. Women kissed, held hands, slept side by side. It was a world in which female companionship was essential, and sometimes indistinguishable from desire. In 15th century Italy, a case was brought before the Venetian Inquisition involving a woman named Benedetta Carlini, a nun who claimed to have mystic visions, and who also carried on a sexual relationship with another nun for years. The scandal rocked her convent, not because she loved another woman, but because she acted on it and claimed divine approval. That crossed a line. Yet, in many other convents, such bonds passed without notice, or were simply not recorded. The line between friendship and romance was often too thin to define, too socially risky to challenge. Meanwhile, in cities like Florence, Paris, and London, the topic of male-male intimacy shows up in legal records, sermons, and, sometimes surprisingly, literature. Certain guilds became associated with rumors of sodomitic behavior, often as a way to discredit rivals or justify moral crackdowns. These accusations could be politically motivated, weaponized, or completely unfounded. But they weren't always false. In 15th century Florence, records from the officers of the night, a city task force created to root out sodomy, list thousands of men investigated or charged with same-sex acts. Most were punished with fines or brief exile. Repeat offenders could face branding or worse. But what's striking is the sheer volume of names. Clearly, desire wasn't easily legislated out of existence. Fringe tidbit. Some men in late medieval France formed secret brotherhoods with coded language, meeting in bathhouses or private homes. There's even record of underground gatherings with mock marriages, complete with rings and feast days. Satirical poems of the time mention these unions with equal parts scorn and fascination. Of course, risk was ever present. For most people, same-sex desire had to be disguised, redirected, or denied. Some turned to confessional booths, praying away their urges. Others entered unhappy marriages to maintain appearances. A few chose the church itself, hoping that vows of chastity might also quiet the heart. And yet, even with the shame and fear, love still bloomed. In stolen glances, in letters that danced around meaning, in whispered conversations behind market stalls, or along the edges of pilgrimage roads. One documented pair of male pilgrims, traveling through southern France in the 13th century, stayed together for over 2 years, sharing food, money, and sleeping space. Their journal entries speak of devotion, jealousy, longing, and though they never named what they were, it's hard to read their story as just companionship. So, what does all this mean? That medieval same-sex love existed, quietly, fiercely, awkwardly. It wore many masks: friendship, loyalty, religious rapture. Sometimes it hid. Sometimes it danced right out in the open and dared the world to blink first. You pause beneath a window now. The shutters open just a crack. Inside, 2 men sit side by side, one reading aloud from a book, the other watching the firelight play across his friend's face. A hand brushes another, briefly, then lingers. Because even in a world that tried to silence it, love always found a way to speak. A soft breeze curls through the narrow streets, carrying the scents of baked bread and damp stone. You wander toward the town square, where a group of children are gathered, listening wide-eyed to a storyteller weaving tales by firelight. Among these stories are whispered hints about medieval attitudes toward masturbation, a topic wrapped in shame, fear, and a surprising amount of misunderstanding. Unlike today, where masturbation is generally accepted as normal, even healthy, in the medieval world, it was mostly viewed as a dangerous distraction from spiritual purity. The Church's stance was clear. Any sexual act outside procreative intercourse was sinful, and self-pleasure ranked high among the offenses. The sin was often lumped under onanism or self-abuse, both terms loaded with centuries of moral judgment. Monks and priests preached against it fiercely, warning that it led to physical weakness, madness, and eternal damnation. Some medieval medical texts claimed that excessive masturbation could cause blindness, infertility, or even death. You might think they were exaggerating, but given the herbal remedies sold at apothecaries for cleansing the body of impure humors, the fear was very real. Yet, despite the fear and stigma, evidence suggests masturbation was common, and perhaps even more so than we might guess. Artists and marginalia often include playful, sometimes crude depictions of figures pleasuring themselves or others, a sly wink to a reality the sermons tried to deny. One of the more curious findings is that marginal drawings in religious manuscripts frequently included naughty scenes, suggesting scribes and monks had a sense of humor about the topic, or at least weren't immune to temptation. The stakes for confessing such sins were high. A monk caught with himself might be disciplined or forced into penance. A noblewoman suspected of self-indulgence could face gossip and scandal. Yet, some confessional manuals offered advice on how priests should handle these cases with discretion, indicating that these confessions weren't rare. There's also a fringe fact here. Some medieval remedies for masturbation involved wearing metal rings around the genitals, designed to curb desire by causing discomfort. A medieval chastity device of sorts. Others suggested carrying amulets or reciting prayers at moments of temptation. Historians still debate how widespread these practices were and how seriously they were enforced. In rural areas, less influenced by strict church oversight, attitudes might have been more relaxed. Among the nobility, sexual education was minimal, and private behaviors were often unspoken but tolerated if discreet. In the quiet of your room, you realize that the medieval world's relationship with masturbation was complicated, wrapped in religious fear, social norms, and human reality. It's a reminder that even centuries ago, people grappled with the same bodily impulses and moral dilemmas as today, just with different rules, rituals, and remedies. You move now through the hushed halls of a grand medieval castle, tapestries muffling footsteps and the faint scent of roasted meat lingering from the great hall. This is where power lives, the seat of kings, queens, knights, and all the drama that comes with ruling land and people. And when it comes to sex, castles were both stage and secret, filled with politics, passion, and pressure. Medieval marriage among the nobility was rarely about romance. It was a business deal, a treaty signed with a kiss, often arranged long before the bride or groom even understood what was expected. Families used marriage to secure land, form alliances, and increase influence. Love? That was optional. But here's the kicker. Even though sex was required, often urgently, it was wrapped in layers of ritual and etiquette. Virginity mattered. So did producing heirs. And yet, the actual experience was often awkward, confusing, and not at all like the passionate scenes you see in movies. The bridal night was a highly charged event. The groom, sometimes a teenager himself, was expected to consummate the marriage quickly and effectively, but education about sex was minimal. Often, fathers or older relatives gave vague or incorrect advice. One medieval manual suggests holding a candle near the bride's face to calm her nerves. Another recommends lifting the bride's veil to signal the moment was serious business. Virgin brides might be terrified, and some men struggled with expectations. The bed was often decorated with flowers, and attendants sometimes stayed nearby, ready to intervene if things went awry. In some cases, courtiers acted as witnesses to the first night to confirm the bride's virginity the next day. Because, yes, proof was that important. Historians still argue about how much choice these couples had, and how often consummation was delayed or resisted. In some rare cases, marriages were annulled because the couple never consummated, a legal loophole that could be exploited for political gain. Outside the bridal chamber, nobles frequently engaged in extramarital affairs. Courtesans and mistresses played key roles in courts, offering companionship and sometimes political influence. Some kings maintained official mistresses, whose favor could shape policy or inheritance. Their bedrooms were private theaters of intrigue, where power and desire collided. But sex wasn't always about power. Nobles wrote love poetry, exchanged delicate gifts, and engaged in flirtation that sometimes led to genuine affection. The troubadour tradition celebrated courtly love, idealizing passion often kept secret or unrequited. On a quirky note, Some aristocratic men carried perfumed handkerchiefs or aromatic sachets to mask less than pleasant bodily odors during close encounters. Medieval hygiene wasn't glamorous, and while we're on hygiene, medieval castles often had rudimentary or shared bathing facilities. People believed in balancing bodily humors, so bathing too often was sometimes discouraged, fearing it could weaken the body. This led to some creative scent choices. One fringe tidbit involves love potions brewed in castle kitchens, made from ingredients like rose petals, ambergris, and crushed pearls. These were believed to spark desire or ensure fidelity, though whether they worked or just smelled nice remains up for debate. The tension between duty, desire, and decorum defined noble sex life. For some, it was a joyful expression within strict boundaries. For others, a source of anxiety and conflict. So, as you step out of the castle and into the cool night air, remember, behind the grand tapestries and velvet curtains were very human stories of nervous first kisses, secret rendezvous, and the relentless hope that love might somehow sneak past all the rules. You wander now into the marketplace at dawn, when the world is just waking, and the air is thick with the scent of fresh bread, wet wool, and the occasional whiff of something less savory. Here, the town's procreation rituals and folk beliefs come alive in whispered conversations and the daily bustle of life. In medieval communities, sex was more than pleasure or duty. It was deeply entangled with superstition and ritual. People believed the forces of nature, the stars, and even household spirits influenced fertility, conception, and birth. Every act carried a hint of magic, whether they admitted it or not. For example, couples trying to conceive might consult a wise woman, a healer, herbalist, or midwife, who could prescribe charms, prayers, and potions. Sometimes the advice involved carrying a particular stone, wearing a piece of cloth from a bride's wedding dress, or performing a ritual on specific holy days. One popular belief was that sex during certain lunar phases increased fertility, while others warned against it during eclipses or on Fridays. Farmers and peasants tracked these signs closely, hoping to align their lives with cosmic rhythms. Fertility was so crucial that communities developed elaborate rites to encourage it. The maypole dance, for instance, was a vibrant celebration of spring and rebirth, famous for its suggestive symbolism, from the tall, erect pole to the ribbons winding around it. Historians still debate how explicitly sexual these rituals were, but there's little doubt they celebrated the power of growth, life, and union. In rural areas, it was common to incorporate fertility symbols into everyday objects. Carved wooden phalluses on house beams, painted eggs during spring festivals, or even the shape of bread loaves. These objects acted as protective talismans against infertility and miscarriage. On the other hand, people feared evil eye curses and malevolent spirits that could block conception or harm unborn children. To counteract this, couples might sleep with an amulet or recite prayers passed down through generations. Interestingly, sex itself was sometimes viewed as a spiritual act. Certain medieval texts describe intercourse as a moment of union, not only between bodies, but between souls, though this view was typically reserved for married couples. Celibates or outsiders often misunderstood or mocked it. One of the quirkiest folk customs was the bridal bed blessing, a ritual performed by family or neighbors before the wedding night. They would sprinkle herbs, salt, or holy water on the bed to ward off evil and ensure fertility. Sometimes, they even placed a knife under the mattress as a protection. there were also stories about animals influencing human fertility, like the belief that if a woman saw a rabbit or a toad on her wedding day, she might have trouble conceiving. Rabbits, with their prolific reputation, were symbols of fertility, but also mischief. You can almost hear the laughter of young couples sneaking behind haystacks, hearts pounding both from desire and the weight of all these invisible eyes and expectations. Fringe fact: in some villages, couples would exchange love tokens made from parts of animals, like carved bone pendants or feathers believed to bring passion and luck. Sometimes these were given secretly during courtship, akin to medieval charm bracelets. Despite all these customs, sex and fertility remained deeply personal, messy, and unpredictable. No amount of ritual could guarantee a child or a happy marriage, but the effort itself offered comfort and community. So, as the sun rises higher over the marketplace, you realize that medieval sex was woven into every corner of life, from the laws of nature to the prayers whispered in candlelit rooms. It was a dance of hope, fear, and endless human yearning. You step into the bustling courtyard of a medieval university, the air thick with the smell of parchment, ink, and the occasional whiff of unwashed robes. Here, among the scholars and students, sex becomes not just a bodily act, but a topic of intense debate, theological wrangling, and, believe it or not, sometimes awkward scientific inquiry. Medieval universities, though rooted in faith, were surprisingly open forums for discussing human sexuality, at least in theory. Professors dissected texts from Aristotle, Galen, and early church fathers, trying to reconcile observed reality with religious doctrine. Sex was often analyzed in terms of humoral theory, where the balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile influenced desire and fertility. Medical students learned that heat and wetness were essential to reproduction, and that both men and women contributed seed during intercourse, though exactly how remained a subject of confusion and debate. One particularly influential text was The Art of Love by Ovid, translated into Latin and studied alongside the Bible. It detailed courtship, passion, and desire with an explicitness that sometimes shocked medieval sensibilities, but fascinated scholars nonetheless. Despite the prudish exterior of the church, some professors encouraged frank conversations about sexual health. They discussed impotence, infertility, nocturnal emissions, and the importance of moderation. It wasn't all prudery. There was genuine curiosity about how the human body worked. But as much as scholars dissected the mechanics of sex, moral condemnation lurked beneath the surface. The concept of lust was one of the 7 deadly sins, and avoiding it was a lifelong challenge. Confessors kept manuals on how to recognize and punish sexual sins, from fornication to masturbation to adultery. Fringe tidbit: some scholars believed that reading erotic poetry could inflame passions, and thus should be banned, or at least read only in moderation. Others thought that discussing sex openly could lead to temptation, so lectures were often cloaked in euphemism. Interestingly, university towns became hotspots for youthful experimentation. Students far from home indulged in drinking, gambling, and, yes, sex, sometimes with local women, sometimes with each other. Prostitution thrived near campuses, and city authorities struggled to keep order. Historians still argue how openly students discussed their exploits. Some records show detailed confessions of sexual misdeeds. Others hint at a code of silence. But the pattern is clear. Universities were places where medieval sexual mores met youthful rebellion head-on. One of the quirkiest medical remedies studied was the use of love philters. Potions brewed from everything from crushed gems to animal parts, intended to induce desire or fidelity. Professors debated their efficacy, often dismissing them but acknowledging their popularity. You watch as a young scholar nervously approaches a street vendor, selling miracle ointments and virility salves, unsure whether to indulge his curiosity or clutch his prayer book tighter. In the medieval world, knowledge about sex was a mix of faith, folklore, and emerging science, sometimes clashing, sometimes blending. And through it all, the human desire to understand one of life's most basic pleasures never faded. As twilight falls, you find yourself outside a small rural chapel, its stone walls glowing softly in the fading light. Inside, villagers gather for a nighttime vigil, voices lifted in prayer and song. Here, at the intersection of faith and flesh, you glimpse the complex role of the church in shaping medieval sexuality, sometimes guiding, sometimes restricting, often wrestling with its own contradictions. The church's teachings on sex were clear and strict. Sex was sacred, but only within marriage and always for the purpose of procreation. Lust, adultery, masturbation, and same-sex acts were condemned as sins, threatening both the soul and the social order. Clergy preached these rules with passion, warning of eternal punishment. Yet, paradoxically, the church was deeply involved in regulating sexual behavior, from marriage contracts to confessionals, and sometimes even offering pragmatic advice on sexual health. Priests served as moral guides and gatekeepers, often caught between doctrine and the messy realities of human desire. Confessionals were both places of judgment and confessionals of hope. Parishioners confessed sins ranging from lustful thoughts to forbidden encounters, seeking absolution but also sometimes sympathy. Some confessors offered practical advice, like abstaining during certain seasons or delaying intercourse when health was poor, while others insisted on strict penance. Marriage itself was a sacrament, but also a social contract. The church set minimum ages, often surprisingly young by modern standards, and required consent. Yet arranged marriages were common, sometimes forcing young people into beds with strangers. This led to tensions and occasional cases of annulment or escape. Interestingly, some clergy held surprisingly progressive views. St. Augustine, often cited for his strict teachings, also recognized the complexity of human desire and the importance of compassion. Some medieval theologians debated whether sex within marriage, while necessary, could also be joyful and loving. One quirky ecclesiastical practice was the marriage by proxy, where a groom could be represented by a stand-in if he couldn't attend the ceremony. This led to stories of mix-ups and mistaken identities, which could complicate the consummation question. The church also influenced popular attitudes about modesty and dress. Sumptuary laws dictated what different classes could wear, often aiming to prevent sexual temptation by limiting flashy clothing or jewelry. For women, modesty was paramount. Loose hair or revealing gowns were frowned upon. Yet medieval art and literature reveal a tension. From bawdy folk tales to sacred hymns, sexuality was simultaneously feared, celebrated, and explored. Saints' lives sometimes included stories of temptation and purity, reminding believers of the constant spiritual battle. A fringe fact: some monasteries housed sex manuals written by monks, not for themselves, but to instruct married couples on how to fulfill marital duties without sinning. These texts balanced theology and practical advice, often with surprisingly detailed descriptions. The Church's role in medieval sex was neither entirely repressive nor fully permissive. It was a complex dance between control and compassion, between law and love, between fear and hope. As you leave the chapel and step into the cool night, you realize the medieval world was far from simple. Sex was a sacred, sinful, joyous, and fraught part of life, woven deeply into the fabric of faith and everyday existence. The night has deepened, and you find yourself wandering through a quiet village square bathed in moonlight, where shadows lengthen and the world seems to hold its breath. Here, in the hush between dusk and dawn, you contemplate the intimate rhythms of medieval life, the unspoken desires, the secret fears, and the fragile hopes that shaped how people lived, loved, and dreamed. Medieval sex was never simple. It was governed by laws both written and unwritten, shaped by religion and superstition, and colored by the very human need for connection. Whether in the courts of kings or the cottages of peasants, the same questions echoed: how to balance duty and desire, how to navigate love in a world that often denied it, how to find joy when so much was forbidden. You remember the brothels tucked behind city walls, the secret herbs whispered between friends, the passionate letters hidden in monastery archives. You recall the risky gambles of love outside marriage, the rituals to ensure fertility, and the harsh judgments of those who dared to stray. And yet, amid the rules and restrictions, people found ways to express themselves, to laugh, to yearn, to resist. The medieval world was full of contradictions, sacred and profane, brutal and tender, public and private. As your footsteps fade into the silence, you feel a quiet kinship with those who lived centuries ago, grappling with the same messy, beautiful complexity of being human. So now, as you prepare to rest, let the night wrap you gently in its embrace. Remember that across time and space, our desires and fears connect us in an unbroken chain. Sleep peacefully, knowing that every whispered secret, every hidden longing, is part of the story of us all.